Right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those in Singapore, and of course, good evening to those in the US. My name is Dr. Tiang Boon, and I'm delighted to be here to be chairing the RSIS webinar on the evolving US-China strategic competition in technology. Right. All of you know that in recent years, the US-China rivalry in various dimensions. And one of those arenas is the domain of technology. Right. So today we are fortunate to have Dr. Adam Garfinkle, who is the RSIS Distinguished Visiting Fellow and the founding editor of the American Interest, here with us this morning to share his insights. Right. If I may briefly introduce Dr. Adam Garfinkle, Dr. Garfinkle, in addition to being the founding editor of the American Interest, he has also served as editor of the National Interest, a leading foreign policy magazine in the US. He's also the former principal speechwriter to the US Secretary of State, while he has also have had experience at the policy planning staff of the State Department. He has also taught at various institutions of higher education in the United States. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over the Zoom screen to Dr. Garfinkle. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. It's nice to be back again, even though it's it's Thursday night where I am. It's not Friday morning, and as before when I've done these, it's past my bedtime. So you'll forgive me if if it looks like I'm about to fall asleep. I'm going to try not to. I want to start off by issuing two preliminary caveats, so to speak, about what I can and cannot do with a subject like this. Sino-American competition, strategic competition with respect to technology. First of all, I didn't invent the topic any more than I invented the topic last time about nationalism and ideology in the Sino-American relationship. But I'm game for it for two reasons. One is that a magazine editor of a thought magazine, actually you'd learn a lot from world-class experts in these subjects. I mean, all you got to do if you have somebody else's money to spend is essentially, formulate a really good question with the help of your, friends and experts. Get somebody who really knows this stuff to write it, and then in the process of producing that essay, editing that essay, and publishing that essay, the editor, learns quite a bit. So if you do this for like 20 years or so, which I did, it's amazing how much you can learn from really, really smart people. Second reason is that I do have a personal and longstanding interest in the history and sociology of science and technology. I minored in it in university, and I took graduate courses in it. And I've been reading about it in one way or another for almost four decades. And it really is a capacious subject. I mean, if you thought that this kind of subject was going to be sort of narrow and technical and manageable, you should think again. There are in the United States, and I think also in Europe, I don't really know about Asia or Singapore even, but there are interdisciplinary programs at major universities that combine all sorts of disciplines to study these questions. So that, for example, both history and military history are involved in discussions of technology, science and technology, and various competitions. There is, of course, history and sociology of science, which in the United States is a discipline unto itself. Social psychology, sociology of bureaucracy, how small groups behave, cultural anthropology, I mean, obviously aspects of political science, government and administration, business, history of business. And there's so many disciplines that come to play if you're trying to get a synoptic understanding of this subject, that whole semester programs, and even undergraduate specialty disciplines rotate around this whole question. Most of the time, the military aspect or the strategic aspect, military strategic aspect, is for specialists. And really people are talking about the relationship between culture and innovation and growth and other factors that contribute to economic reality like demography and education, things like that. But it's a major, capacious, large subject. And obviously, just in case you didn't realize it, I mean, my degree is in social science. I'm not a nuclear physicist. I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert in genetics. I'm not a rocket scientist. So there are a lot of technical questions about the kind of technology that is in play is in competitive play today between the United States and China and other countries that I cannot speak to in technical terms. And really the last time that I was into this kind of subject was about 22 years ago. And I was mainly concerned with energy at the time. And the cybernetic revolution had happened, but it wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. So if somebody had said to me the last time that I really kind of looked into this stuff, you know, what do you think about 5G and 6G and the sixth industrial revolution? I would have said, what? I mean, it hadn't happened yet. So I'm kind of behind the curve when it comes to the actual technology. And the second thing I want to warn you about is that, you know, half of this equation is about China. I mean, that's part of the rivalry, the Sino-American rivalry. I'm not an expert on anything concerning China, not Chinese language, not Chinese history, not Chinese art, and not contemporary Chinese industry and science and technology. And plenty of people who are expert on it, and I know some of them, and I've read some of that stuff, and I've talked to people, but I myself am in no way an independent expert on the Chinese side of this equation. I've been to China a couple of times, so that doesn't really count. Spending altogether a couple of weeks in China doesn't count, doesn't make you an expert. Some journalists like to claim otherwise, but they can claim in whatever they like. So this is a really capacious subject. And I think what I can do for you, though, in a relatively short presentation, I've been given about 35 minutes. You know, people who've lectured at universities always speak in 40, 45-minute glops. Can't speak longer, can't speak shorter. You're kind of just habituated to the university lecture period, but I'll keep it short. What I can do is I can formulate the kind of questions one would need to ask and get answered in order to get really get arms around this subject of this competition. And I can draw on some of the writings that I published when I was an editor and others that speak to this in more I don't know, with more gravitas than I can based on what I know. So we'll focus on the questions, and then I'll try to give just a few remarks about, you know, how one might look to find an answer. I may drop some citations along the way, because there are things that some of you might want to read that I don't have time to summarize right now, but that I can refer you to if you're interested in doing more. So the first thing I think that first question that you would ask if you were really going to, you know, get your arms around the subject is, what's the relationship between culture on the one hand and innovation in a culture, in an economy, and economic growth? I mean, you know, clearly, I mean, you just look at the world, look at history. You don't have to be a great expert to realize that some societies have generated indigenous economic growth over a fairly long period of time, and others have not. And I think most people, I mean, there are lots of, you know, modes of explanation for this. I mean, Jared Diamond, for example, talks about geography and resource endowments and climate, things like that. But most people think that culture has a lot to do with it. Late David Landis wrote a book about this. You know, about why some countries seem to prosper and others don't. There's something in the Weltanschauung of the culture that seems to predispose certain kinds of societies to think less in cyclical, you know, returning kind of ways, and more in linear ways. It's where this all comes from, why it differs from place to place, is a fascinating subject. But there clearly are differences, and you know, we know from history, for example, that, you know, back in the old days, many centuries ago, in China, there were some remarkable men and women, I suppose, who did remarkable things and came up with remarkable inventions. Everybody knows about the famous Admiral Zheng He. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Who built these amazingly large and formidable boats, sailed into the blue water oceans of the world, made discoveries and so forth, and then was prohibited. Apparently, and this is the story that I've read, prohibited by the government from continuing and exploiting some of these discoveries and some of these possibilities, just for lack of any interest, on the part of the empire of the day in expanding beyond the cultural zone of the Middle Kingdom. Then there's a question was asked by a well-known historian of science named Joseph Needham 70, 80 years ago, wrote a multi-volume series of works just asking the basic question. The Chinese had all of the elements of a scientific revolution, but they didn't put together a scientific revolution. That happened instead in the West. Why is that? So Professor Needham wrote book after book after book trying to figure out, going into detail about exactly why that didn't happen. But China's not the only example of having a lot of the pieces for what the West eventually managed to achieve. Western Europe, the United States later managed to achieve in the 1600s and 1700s. For example, the Romans understood the steam power. There were toys in Roman Republic and Roman Empire times, toys made out of steam. But it never occurred to anybody to scale it up and actually use it on an industrial scale. Why was that? How come nobody stood back and took the next step? Where was the vision? Where was the creativity? It didn't happen, at least not then. There are lots of examples from other cultures of having lots of little pieces of the puzzle that defines the modern scientific technical world, which came out of the West mainly. Why didn't some other culture, with certainly people just as smart and traditions just as open, why didn't they do that? So this is a question people will be kicking around for the next I don't know how long. One of the things that Anglo-Americans had going for them is pretty much a highly individualistic. This comes out of the religious culture, comes out of the Protestant Reformation in part. At that point in time, a highly individualistic culture, a culture that because of the nature of the religious thinking, gave a lot of credit to the virtues of doubt, the virtues of humility, working together, and having a less hierarchical kind of social order. Then there are the rogue factors. I mean, the person I know named William Rosen wrote a book on the history of patent law. Patent law is a neglected subject, but it can, according to one argument, explains a lot about why some cultures manage to create innovation and growth and tie it together, in a societal whole, in both economic and military ways that other cultures can't seem to manage. It's important that people, can essentially own their own intellectual property. If people can't own it and can't profit from it, there's less incentive to actually create it. And there's certainly less incentive to share it and work together with others. So even the nature of law, contract law and patent law, has a major impact over time on how the institutions function. And there are comparative studies of these things. And so, this is again, the literature is vast, no matter where you look on this subject. And so there's a lot to know, and there's a lot to ask and a lot to think about. There are even specific military aspects of this that are worth noting. So of course there's a relationship between the openness and the vitality of the culture in terms of discovery, and then there's a connection between that and innovation. And innovation isn't a thing. I mean, it's one thing to invent a thing, a machine, a technology. But a technology is not innovation. It's just a machine. There's a difference between technology and technique. All right, just like when somebody invents something in an industrial setting, all right, it's not worth anything until somebody creates a manufacturing process that can actually produce it at scale. And there have to be connections to marketing and to law in order to get an invention to actually make a difference in terms of a national economy, and for that matter, an international economy. So it's not just, really what we're talking about is a verb. Innovation is a process. And its contribution to economic growth and also to military security are a series of overlayered processes. It's better to think of these things in terms of a verb rather than a noun like a machine or a thing or an engineering marvel. And of course, there's also a difference between science, technology, and engineering. It's an obvious point, but people often neglect it. You have to create for society to really be an innovative society, for it to be at the cutting edge. There has to be a way that the various institutions in society harmonize, right? So that they can work together rather than at cross purposes to one another. The three critical things that are the formula for success in the modern world are human capital, right? Brain power, right? Social trust, social capital, some people put it. And the third is institutional coherence within institutions and institutional coordinations among institutions in a national setting, or in some cases an international setting. All of that stuff has to work in order to maximize individual brain power and vision and creativity. Just inventing the machine or inventing some process or discovering some scientific principle isn't enough, to drive it through into actual economic value and then to derive whatever military security benefits there might be for defense and so forth. So a good example to show how this filters down ultimately to the military level and how culture matters here. You know, you look at the performance of the German army in World War I and World War II in the you know the wars of the beginning of the 20th century. If you read the military historians on this subject, what the Germans were really good at were tactics, and they were very good at engineering. They had good stuff. I mean, their weapons were good. They also had they had great discipline. They had very skillful and brave soldiers in both wars. So pound for pound, you know, the Germans were on a par with who they were fighting in the First World War and the Second World War. They lost both wars. And it wasn't because of size or geography. It was because, although the Germans were very good at tactics, the Weltanschauung of the German military was very hierarchical. And so the generals who were running the show didn't think much about what was above and what was below the question of tactics. They didn't think about strategy, which is very ironic considering that Clausewitz wrote in German. But they also didn't think, and they didn't do very well with it when it came to logistics and intelligence. They made huge mistakes in World War I, and then they repeated the mistakes in World War II. So the Weltanschauung, the worldview of a culture, how rigid it is, how much social trust there is in it, how flexible the leadership and the authority lines are within the organizations and the institutions of the military, how they liaise with the political and the other parts of a government. All those things matter when you're prosecuting a war. It's not just the machines. It's not just the machines. Second question is, what's changed in recent years? Before we get to China and the United States specifically, the last sort of, you know, contextual comment on what's changed. And I think it's important to kind of take a step back to get an idea of what's changed. Let me see if I can find my notes here. That would be nice. Okay. So, you know, the idea that technological innovation can be a driver for economic success and even for winning armies and growing economies so that the economy can support, you know, a military, is at least as old as the Roman Empire. And the best example that I can think of, and others have pointed to this too, is the Appian Way, the famous Roman road. So it was a transportation network that for its time was very, very sophisticated. It was an accelerator for Roman military conquests and defense and for commerce. It allowed the Romans to move armies much more quickly and with better command and control than other armies, and it facilitated commerce that fueled a growing economy and that sustained the Republic and later, of course, the Roman Empire. It was literally an early super highway for information. So for the next 2,000 years, the Appian Way inspired a lot of imitation and a lot of study. There were libraries full of books that discuss the history of science and technology. It's really started then, and they all have one thing in common from the Appian Way all the way through the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the conviction that innovation matters. Sometimes it matters decisively in the economic, social, military, and political affairs of mankind. And this is different. You know, there were times when it wasn't scientific technical innovation that people thought was attractive in terms of politics. Even into the 19th and 20th century, you have the example of the Habsburg Monarchy. The Habsburg Monarchy was admired throughout Europe and throughout much of the world, as was the Safavid dynasty in Persian. So why? Not because of their military technical prowess, but because of their aesthetics, right? It was the art, it was the opera, it was the dance, it was the architecture. So it wasn't always the scientific technical sort of muscle of a society that was its drawing card, that made it attractive. But increasingly, as we come to modern times, science and technology has been much more important. But then something happened. Something happened on the way to to our century that differed in at least qualitatively, if not quantitatively, from the time of the Industrial Revolution until this century. So even as military technology itself grew in lethality, I mean, the atomic bomb is of course the best example, it was still rarely decisive in political or military outcomes. There are exceptions. I mean, the atomic bomb did end the war with Japan in 1945, did end the Pacific War, but in theory, at least, you know, Julius Caesar and George Patton could have sat down together, I mean, if, you know, in a fantasy world, discussing tactics for desert warfare or crossing the Rhine, and they would have understood each other, you know, reasonably well. So while the way of war changes and how that's connected to the science and technology that drives economic growth, while the way of war changes, the actual nature of war, why people fight, why people engage in political rivalries that can sometimes end up in fighting, doesn't change as much. All right. So weapons mattered, and they still matter, but they don't matter more than the soldier's skill, more than morale, more than leadership, more than planning, more than training, more than weather, and sometimes even more than luck. I mean, luck matters too. During World War II, though, it became apparent, at least to some people in leadership positions, that new technology itself, much of it engined by basic scientific research, could actually win wars. The machines could actually win wars. And you mentioned the atomic bomb, but there were lots of other examples that come out of the experience of the Second World War. Microwave radar, proximity fuses, which came out of the MIT Radiation Laboratory in the United States. So really by the 1940s and 50s, things had changed. Applied science now became something that could transform the nature of war and geopolitics with it, and in a way that was not even imaginable early in the 20th century or before. You look at the Cold War. The scientific technical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War was a critical part of the whole Cold War, you know, experience. It was believed to be critical in military strategic ways, but it also had a huge reputational value. You know, the country that could be more modern scientifically and create the most vibrant economic growth on the basis of science, of applied science, you know, that was part of the marketing of the ideologies that dominated the two sides. So it was not just that science and technology mattered as a reputational and in a political way, as well as being believed to be, you know, a fundamental element in the outcome of a military competition. So this is something. If you stand back, right, from about the 1700s, technological changes have sort of pulsed out in multi-decadal sort of flows. There are some people who have argued that with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, sometime in the 1700s, people date it differently, that you've had an industrial transformation that's occurred roughly every half century since then. And of course, the most recent one is the cybernetic revolution. Now, the United States has led the last three innovation cycles with information technology at the epicenter of the latest technology. And as with the Appian Way, you know, almost 2,000 years ago, the core techniques of the present innovation wave generate mutually reinforcing economic and military advantage. Why a lot of the technologies, increasingly so, now are dual use. It becomes very difficult to distinguish between, you know, what's for military purposes and what's for non-military purposes. And this is also something that's different from the way things were even 30, 40 years ago. This isn't just a spin-off from, like, you know, DARPA spin-offs of technology that end up, you know, in the commercial market. This is a much more intimate connection between the very technologies themselves and their dual use characteristics. Now, let me see, I was looking at the clock here. Let me move right over to the China stuff. So I'd say it's been about 4 or 5 years now that some American military and political leaders have gotten the shakes, basically, about the competitive, scientific, technological competitive challenge that China poses. I mean, I think from the time China changed its attitude toward markets with Deng Xiaoping after 1979-80, I don't think that Americans took Chinese technical and scientific competition very seriously. There are a variety of reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into, but that's not true anymore. When President Xi in January of 2015 spoke about Made in China 2025, it was a big speech. It definitely got the attention of people in the United States, some people in the United States. The point of the speech, if you remember, and those of you who follow this sort of thing, was that China was going to become the master of its own technology by 2025. So that was a 10-year period. The speech was given in 2015. 2025 is about halfway there, right? And China has made some remarkable advances. But according to the American intelligence community, most of it, there's a concern that China doesn't just seek, its own technology independence, but that it seeks mastery of technologies for purposes of global dominance, not necessarily on the military level, but on the commercial level, in a wide array of advanced technology products. And they include, and this list comes out of the Chinese document, not out of thin air. President Xi mentioned artificial intelligence, computers, electrical vehicles, hypersonic and other advanced jet aircraft, machine tools, pharmaceuticals, robotics, and new age semiconductors based on kind of like post-space age ceramics, right? And of course, as I mentioned before, many of these technologies have dual use capabilities. They have military applications and they have non-military applications simultaneously. We know that because we work on them too, and other countries work on them too. I'm going to read a quote from you now from Admiral Dennis Blair. Admiral Blair, as I think many of you remember, was the director of national intelligence during the Obama administration. I mean, not a Trumpista type, but I think that what Admiral Blair said is now pretty much a consensus view in the United States about the Chinese military technical challenge, which wasn't the case even as recently as 4 or 5 years ago. So what he said, and I'm quoting Admiral Blair now. What is troubling about what might be supposed to represent a natural exercise in self-help is that the 2025 strategy involves more than just pulling China up by its own bootstraps through fair and above board means. China also bestows massive subsidies to build up its national technological champions, manipulates technology standards, demands the handover of technology from international companies doing business in China, picks the pockets of foreign firms in China and around the world to acquire valuable technology. That's a euphemism for stealing it. Favors Chinese companies in its domestic market and subsidizes them when they compete internationally, and subsidizes the acquisitions of foreign advanced technology enterprises. And then he writes, U.S. and foreign enterprises across virtually every advanced technology sector, from aerospace and biotechnology to information and communications technology, products, internet, clean energy, digital media, that you could have listed more, I'm still quoting now, have been harmed by China's aggressive use of mercantilist techniques, and will continue to be harmed if China cannot be pressured to roll back its egregious predatory practices, right? Close quote. I mean, I'm not judging this myself. I'm not saying that that Admiral Blair is right about all this. I mean, Americans who know their own history know that back in the 19th century, American diplomats and travelers and sailors stole every piece of technology they could find from Europe. So when we were coming up, a lot of American behavior resembled, at least in a different century, resembled Chinese behavior today. But this is a consensus view, I think, pretty much across the board in U.S. government about what the challenge consists of, and specifically this idea of a sixth industrial revolution that combines many elements of the cybernetic revolution with other advances, really focuses on artificial intelligence, robotics, and autonomous systems, and the Internet of Things. And the view in the United States is that it's not necessarily the case that the United States and its allies and others can't pull themselves off the mat and get back to business. People are suggesting all over the place things that the United States needs to do, from one kind of high-tech national industrial policy to another. So the subject is in play, but there's a sense that the United States has kind of lost its edge. And if you look at the three factors that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago about what really matters and what the formula for success is in the modern world, human capital, education, social trust, institutional coherence within institutions and coordination among them. If you look at each one of these fundamental assets of success for an innovation state, you find that over the past, I don't know, pick a set of years, 25 to 30 years, the United States has not done as well as it used to in any of these three areas. I mean, if you go back to the Manhattan Project, which is kind of the quintessence of how institutional dovetailing works, okay? You have the military, you have business, and you have the government all working together within universities at Los Alamos to create, an atomic bomb. In the 60s, 70s, we had the space program, put a man on the moon, did a lot more. One wonders, actually, if the institutional coherence among American institutions is good enough today to repeat any of those things, to repeat any of those feats. I'm skeptical. The United States has enormous advantages in the scientific technical field, but as I said before, just being able to have brilliant scientists and invent some cool machines or discover some neat stuff, that's not enough. It's a system. Let me just say one more thing before I go to an anecdote and try to bring this to an inadequate close. But the Manhattan Project, in the literature on innovation, especially in military stuff, this is called the pipeline system. This is what Vannevar Bush described in The Endless Frontier after the end of the Second World War. But basically, what you do is, you're trying to a major effort that brings together government and military and universities, scientists and commercial scientists, Bell Lab scientists. What you're trying to do is you're looking toward a product. You're trying to create some particular thing that you need and that you presumably need in a hurry. So what you do is you create innovation organizations that involve basically small groups and people. This eventually evolved into DARPA in the United States, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. But there's another way to do it. After Sputnik in October 1957, the United States took a different attitude. After the World War II, the pipeline system that produced the atomic bomb, and then later the hydrogen bomb, that's kind of dismantled. During the Eisenhower administration, though, a different kind of institutional coordination or cohesion was put together, and this was instead of the pipeline construction of it. What was it called? I can't remember the name of it. You were feeding basic science, and then you were basically dumping a lot of money on basic R&D. Basic science, in the hopes that you weren't operating to produce some specific outcome, something or some process. You were just feeding basic science with the trust, the belief that it would eventually produce useful things both for the economy and for the military, and that you could set up an institutional structure that could take the inventions or the discoveries and bring them along all the way on the path to marketization and to uses of the military. But that system in the United States now has changed. The United States spends about as much money on R&D now as it did 15, 20 years ago, but a lot of the money is being spent by companies in the commercial sector, not by the government. And a lot of the money is basically designed to produce products that can be sold for a profit. So there's less government investment in basic science than there was before. There's also less investment, as everybody knows, in infrastructure. And here's another aspect of this that I didn't mention, but I will quickly. The Belt and Road Initiative. People have disagreements about what the Chinese actual motives are in Belt and Road. But whatever the sum total of all the motives may be, one thing certainly that is true is that if a developing country is looking for a model and some funding to build infrastructure, they're much more likely, the image of China being able to do these things well and quickly, right, is much more appealing to a lot of places than it is to the United States. The Chinese have built 3 international airports from scratch, from absolutely nothing, from a cornfield or a wheat field, in the time that it's taken the United States not to be able to run a metro line from downtown Washington to Dulles Airport. We are so balled up in not in my backyard NIMBY problems everybody having a veto over building new infrastructure. So people, it's not about the money. We have the money to build new infrastructure, but we are institutionally deranged so that we can't agree on what to do, how to finance it, and how to maintenance it. Infrastructure in the United States is falling apart for a variety of reasons, but it's not because we can't afford it. I wish that was all that was the reason. So what's a country in South Asia or in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America? Chinese infrastructure exports are very attractive because they work. There are not a lot of restrictions on them, and the loans, the money can come pretty quickly and without a lot of political strings. So this is a major asset that the Chinese have in terms of, I wouldn't want to call it soft power, but it certainly is it's attractive politically to a lot of countries, that was not the case, for example, in the Cold War. I mean, there weren't a whole lot of countries who were deeply desirous of Soviet infrastructure help. American infrastructure help, yeah, and others. So that's another aspect of this that's very different from before. And one other thing I want to mention. Nothing that's new in the strategic competition. It's very important. Last thing I'll mention, then I'll tell you a story. Last thing I'll mention, the story. So it used to be, until just a couple of decades ago, people imagined the scientific technical enterprise being essentially contained within national boundaries. So there were American programs, and there were German programs, and French programs, and Chinese programs, and Soviet programs, but it was a national thing. I mean, you did, sometimes help your allies with technical things, but really the competition was on a national level. That's not this. Things have changed. A woman who was a director of research for the Army for a number of years convinced me that the research and development function worldwide now is much more internationalized. It's not just the literature that's internationalized, but there are centers of technological and scientific excellence in places now that simply wasn't the case 35 or 40 years ago. So it's internationalized, and that puts a huge premium on constructive engagement between the United States and other countries. And it also puts a premium on Chinese engagement with other countries. It seems to me that the United States has an inherent advantage in this because we are much more open to cooperative, positive sum relationships. The Chinese, in their desire to create sort of the unitary state, and to make no separation really between the potential military uses of discovery and the commercial uses, I think I'm much more reluctant to really share and really cooperate with other countries the same way that the United States is. Unfortunately, in the current administration, we don't evince that part of our nature. I think in a Biden administration, we'll return more to normal. But I mean, there's no reason why the United States shouldn't create innovation pods with allies. And there are a lot of countries around the world, small countries, including Singapore, a lot of really smart people, a lot of innovative people, and need a market. And the United States is a huge domestic market, and the United States can knit markets together. And through the American alliance system and through the international trading system that's been created over the past 56, 60 years, the United States as a kind of a hub and a table setter in creating cooperation among different countries. We have a huge advantage in doing that. So we have to internationalize our thinking about research and development and about coordination with our friends and marshaling that coordination to compete with others. I think that's what we need to do, and we so far don't show a lot of evidence in understanding that. But we will. Last thing, I know I'm a little bit over. I mentioned military stuff. I haven't mentioned Intel. Let me just finish with Intel. So I know Mike Rogers, who until April a year ago was the head of the National Security Agency, and I had a couple of conversations with him over the years. And I was at Fort Meade. I guess it was in April 2018. Yeah, that'd be right. And he put it very simply. He said NSA has two basic missions, two functions. One is to secure American information, proprietary information, and information that's relevant to national security. And the second mission is to make sure that other countries' information is not safe. In other words, that we can get our hands on it, that we can spy on them, that we can collect information about other national systems and so forth. Now, from the very beginning of the cybernetic revolution, from Norbert Wiener in 1948 when he wrote the book, all the way through, very recently, all right, the United States dominated this technology, this science and technology. And it was very useful because if you have all the mainframe technology that everybody else is imitating, you know how the screws unscrew and you know how the damn thing works. And it helps you enormously to protect your own stuff, and it helps you enormously to penetrate other people's systems. If in the future, the basic stuff is no longer American, if it's Ericsson, if it's Scandinavian, or if it's Chinese, if it's Huawei, 5G stuff, it makes both tasks a lot more difficult. It makes protecting American information much more difficult, and it makes penetrating other people's systems a lot more difficult. So this is state change. This is a big deal. And although you don't hear a lot about it, in public, in the American intelligence community, especially in the signal intelligence community and NSA, this is a very daunting problem that people are very, very concerned about, and wish that the political leadership would get off their butts and do a little more than they have been. So I'll stop there. Boy, I really have a lot more material that I couldn't get to, but maybe in questions and answers, some of this will come up. So thank you, and we're on to Q&A. Professor?
Thank you very much, Dr. Adam Garfinkle. I thought that was really a very illuminating presentation, and you shared a lot of insights. Right, for the Q&A, perhaps let me remind everyone, because for the attendees, your mic is basically muted. So please do ask your question through this Q&A function in Zoom, which is below your screen. And once you post the question, I'll then, for the benefit of everyone here, I'll try to read out the question, and I'll post the question to Dr. Garfinkle, and then I'll try to follow the queue in which the questions appear, time permitting, right? So we have one question right now in the Q&A box. If I may, briefly summarize the question. The question says that Obama continued with an engagement strategy with China, but Trump decided to ditch this engagement approach, if you will, and it took a decidedly more confrontational approach, in particular targeting trade and technology, right? And this is threatening to decouple the highly entangled US-China economy with obvious repercussions for the global economy. So both strategies have not produced the desired results. Do you think there is a third way?
Well, I think there is a third way, and I think that the third way is kind of inevitable, because this kind of either or, this like dichotomous way of thinking about the subject, I don't think is exactly accurate. I think it's basically true that during the Obama administration, there hadn't been a mental change yet that really had made its way down into U.S. policy, and I think probably there are institutional reasons in the United States that have to do with the relationship of Wall Street and the banks on the one hand, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I mean, the relationship with China, the economic relationship with China, had some economic benefits, but it also had economic costs for the United States, and it helped to exacerbate inequality. But it didn't become political. It became politically salient to some extent. We had Occupy Wall Street, we had the Tea Party, and a lot of that had economic motives. I mean, people were complaining that, they thought anyway, that outsourcing or offshoring American jobs had harmed the United States, and all for the benefit of rich and politically connected people in Washington. And that applied to both Democrats and Republicans, because Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, however different they were temperamentally and otherwise, they had a lot in common. I mean, they were both populist and they were anti-elitist, and their gripe really was about the hollowing out of the middle class. They believed to be the hollowing out of the middle class in the American manufacturing economy. If you look at the numbers of American manufacturing jobs and union jobs that were lost, blue collar, good blue collar jobs that were lost after 1999, 2000, after the extension of most favored nation, permanent most favored nation status to China, and China's joining the WTO, the numbers are breathtaking. I mean, there hasn't been such a rapid decline in a major sectoral area in the United States. I don't think it ever was. So that matters. But I don't think it's fair to say that the Obama administration didn't react at all. And I don't think the change in the relationship is all the fault of Donald Trump and getting tough on tariffs and trade and stuff like that. I mean, Xi Jinping is not Zhang Jimin, is not Hu Jintao, is not Deng Xiaoping. He's not like his three predecessors. He is a much different kind of Chinese leader. And if you look at Chinese behavior, whether it's the wolf warrior diplomats, whether it's the militarization of the islands in the South China Sea, whether it's Ladakh recently and the fist fight with India, whether it's the squelching of the agreement over Hong Kong, Chinese behavior has been, and Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, has been more aggressive across the board. I mean, there are people out there who misused, I think I talked about this last month, who misused the phrase Cold War. They use it very lazily and very, very loosely, and it's misleading. What is going to happen is what is happening is a rivalry. It is not a Cold War. If you're careful about defining what the Cold War was, you see that what's happening with the US and China doesn't fit. Nevertheless, whatever change in the tone of the relationship, it's not the fault of the United States primarily. It's the fault of Chinese behavior. This is no longer a Chinese government that's willing to hide its strength and be patient, as the old aphorism went. That said, Trump administration, for domestic political reasons, thought that a get tough attitude toward China was politically useful. They went about it in a crazy way. I mean, if you want to confront Chinese practices and behaviors, you gather your allies. You don't first alienate them, which is what the Trump administration did from Mexico and Canada to Western Europe to East Asia. So I would also say, that the economic relationship as it had been allowed to develop wasn't necessarily good in every way for the two sides. It locked the Chinese into an export-oriented market longer than it should have been. The Chinese should have been developing, and they know this. Chinese economists know this. Some of them have told me they should have been developing faster and more deeply a domestic market rather than relying on the export market so much, and it distorts the economy. I mean, the Chinese have lots of economic problems. They have the middle income trap. They still have a lot of people to rescue from dire poverty. They have the state-owned enterprises, which are drags on a market economy. They don't have efficient capital markets. They have demographic problems from the legacy of the one-child policy. There are a lot of problems. And the slowdown in the Chinese economy occurred before the Trump administration and before COVID. You could already see the sand in the gears already. So a lot of these things are not the fault of anything Donald Trump did, right? Now, that said, and again, from the United States point of view, you need to listen to some of these people justifying the nature of the economic relationship with China. This didn't seem to care about the hollowing out of the American manufacturing sector. They were talking about, well, it kept inflation low because of all these cheap imports from China, as if somehow, feeding sort of mid to low ranking consumers a lot of junk from China was a compensation for the loss of jobs and the hollowing out of American manufacturing. I mean, this is ludicrous arguments used to make me crazy. So in a way, the relationship had grown too tight and it had grown distortive for both sides. Somebody had to shake the cage and change the relationship. And I'm sorry that it had to be Donald Trump, and I'm sorry that it was the way that it happened, but somebody had to do that eventually. And I think if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, she would have done it differently, but she would have done something very similar. And then again, I quoted Admiral Blair. Well, Admiral Blair was making noises about Chinese problems with China when he was DNI, and he was DNI in the Obama administration, not in the Trump administration. So I think it's not exactly accurate to make a fine, sharp line between Obama being oblivious and weak and Trump being strong. I don't think that's accurate. Moreover, I don't think that people talk about decoupling as though it's like it's a light switch, like it's either hard decoupling or the relationship has to go back to what it was before. And I think that's just not, neither one of those extremes is very likely. These are both very large countries with international economic interests. Even if the United States wanted to ignore China, it can't ignore Asia. It can't ignore East and South Asia. And so it has to deal with China in the context of other relationships, right? With Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Vietnam and so forth. So it's not possible to ignore or decouple completely from China because it's enmeshed in the entire East Asia and South Asia, for that matter, the world. So I think these are exaggerations And I think people need to stand back and understand that this is a kind of a, I don't mean this in the wrong, it's kind of a classic 19th century affair where great powers that are rivals in some respects can cooperate in other respects because they have common interests. As I said last month, I think the overt, explicit ideological dimension of the Sino-American rivalry is not very extensive. I think people confuse that for cultural differences that are very deep and very consequential. But I don't think that there are any overt, explicit ideological, not many ideological elements in all of this. And so it's possible to have a relationship that's mixed, where you can cooperate on a whole range of questions and you can compete on others. And it doesn't have to end up in conflict, and it doesn't have to end up in a war if both sides have sense and understand the mixed relationship. I mean, this is the relationship that Britain had with, that European countries had with each other, and then in the history of South Asia that Indian empires had. This is international politics going back thousands of years, mixed relationships, and it privileges diplomacy, good sense, and patience. And I don't see any necessary reason why the sides can't continue that kind of a mixed relationship for a long time. There are a couple of landmines along the way, and one of them is Taiwan. And if you're watching closely, I mean, I'm not an expert on Taiwan, but if you're watching closely, Taiwan has become more of a political issue in the United States than it was. And you have Democrats as well as Republicans now saying that the American defense of Taiwan is a must. And a lot of that has to do with concern about the momentum from what the Chinese government has done in Hong Kong. So the potential for misunderstanding and accidental trouble over Taiwan, I still don't think that it's inevitable, but I think it's more likely now. A problem over Taiwan is more likely now than I would have said 4, 5, 6 years ago. So we have to watch that really carefully. We'll see who from Taiwan gets invited to the inauguration on January 20th. Whoever wins, but the Democrats are just as blood on the saddle about this, it seems, lately, as Republicans. So that's interesting.
Right. Thanks very much, Adam. I recall a point you mentioned about Xi Jinping, him being, his leadership style being different from his predecessors. I absolutely agree with you on that point. And I just want to quickly mention as a comment that one of the things that is often missed out is that Xi, institutionally within the CCP system, he is the first leader since Deng Xiaoping not to be anointed by Deng himself, because being Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin were both chosen by Deng. So in a way he navigated the complex CCP system and rose on his own steam, without a clear political patron. So that
Right.
possibly could have an impact on his leadership style, right? Okay, we have two questions in the queue. I'll read out the second question in the queue. It says that it says that China is not going about achieving technological supremacy alone. For example, it has secured cooperation with Russia. So do you think it would be remiss to discount Russia's role as a tech player in this tech race?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure that I'm competent to answer it. I'm skeptical, actually, of the closeness of the Russian-Chinese relationship. And there's a great example of a 19th century style mixed relationship. The Russian government, the Chinese government are suspicious of one another. They don't really like one another. They're culturally very dissimilar. I think the Russians are basically in appeasement mode right now. Vladimir Putin has got himself in a position where he can't marshal a friendship with the United States and Europe to deal with China. I think the Russians are afraid of China. I think they look at Siberia and they look at the maritime provinces and they remember those old borders that were drawn in the 19th century under duress from China. And I think the Chinese look to the resources and the fresh water in Siberia. And I think there's a natural competition and problem right there. The two countries see eye to eye when it comes to bringing down the United States, knocking down the United States a notch or two. That enables both more flexibility to pursue their own interests, both parochial and national. But I'm very skeptical about the heart-to-heart love relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And I'm pretty sure that if the Russians have anything that they think is really an ace in the hole technologically, right, the last damn country in the world they're going to give it to is China, and vice versa. All right. Now, for example, both countries are working on hypersonic technology. You know, Chinese have this, Wu-14 hypersonic glide vehicle that comes off the GIF-17 missile. That's pretty sophisticated stuff. And in the hypersonic, research and development field, both sides are ahead of the United States, just temporarily. But I don't think there's been any coordination between the two of them on that. I'd be surprised. I think that's highly proprietary. That's another thing I didn't mention. Let me just, as R&D and the scientific enterprise and technology enterprise becomes more international, attention rises between what you want to share for mutual benefit and what is proprietary to a military strategic point of view. A lot of this stuff is dual use. It's very difficult to segregate. All right. So I think I think a unitary state mentality, CCP, is going to err on the side of safety before giving away technology or trading technology or sharing technology with anybody who thinks they could put it to a military use that would be deleterious to Chinese interests. So it just seems to me that, again, like I said, the United States has an advantage, a big advantage here, because we understand positive sum relationships. We're still an Enlightenment country, right? We're much more willing to create, innovation pods with allies and so forth. I don't think either the Russians or the Chinese are nearly as inclined. They're much more technologically autarkic in this regard than the United States and Western countries. So I don't worry about the Chinese and the Russians really getting into bed in a way that matters. I think they're more likely to fight each other in the long run than they are to give each other good stuff.
If I may make a quick intervention and a follow-up question, one of the things I realize, at least I've noticed, is that the U.S. It seems to recognize the threat that China's technological rise would pose to its interests, in particular national security interests. However, the way, in particular, the Trump administration has tried to respond is that it has tried to delegitimize this rise, and it is tried to do so in this delegitimization through two ways. One, it accuses China of stealing American knowledge and technology. Indeed, the National Security Advisor just this week, I heard he claimed that China tried to steal, U.S. COVID-19 vaccine research. And the other way is that it sort of accuses China of what it calls unfair competition, in the sense that China it provides state support to some of these strategic technological sectors, right?
Yeah.
So having this kind of lens to look at competition from China, do you think it's sort of like will underestimate Chinese indigenous capability and innovation, sort of backfiring on the US in the long run? What's your sense of it?
That's a really excellent. It's not just one question. You've asked a couple of excellent questions put together. Really, I'm really glad you asked. So the Chinese see science and technology prowess as one element of great many in terms of their general influence, their diplomacy of influence. And I just read the other day that the Chinese opened a third R&D facility in Budapest. All right, it's a 5G kind of thing, and the Hungarians are happy about this because they think that the Chinese are gonna train a lot of Hungarian engineers and maybe help some scientists and so forth. So there's cooperation, and that's part of the influence relationship that has many other facets. But it seems to me that we have right now what the Chinese are doing in terms of science and technology, a lot of it is stolen. I mean, it just is. And I said the United States stole technology too in the 19th century, so there's nothing new. What really strikes me about this is how similar Hu Jintao and Donald Trump really are. They're both either call pre or post Enlightenment minds. They really believe that all life is zero sum, and that human nature is fundamentally competitive and conflictual. And neither one grants that human nature is also cooperative. As any fool looking at the world and looking at his own family and looking at his own society can see that it's both. And that's what makes human beings so interesting, because of this mixed, cooperative, competitive nature that we have. But the neo-Marxist, the people who think of themselves as realists, but who are actually cynics, don't grant the cooperative aspect of human nature. And so conflict is never ending. There are only winners and losers. It never resolves. Right? There's no such thing as a real friend. It's only temporary. You instrumentalize others in everything. I mean, that's how that's how Leninists think. And that's obviously how Donald Trump thinks too. And I just find it very amusing that they have a lot more in common in terms of their philosophy of human nature than you might expect. I think that view is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It's a misapprehension of human nature, and it's a kind of a primitivism. It's like primitive social Darwinism before Darwin. Kind of a caricature almost of a survival of the fittest way of thinking about life. And I don't think it rewards itself in the long run. I think it harms itself in the long run. So to me, to get back to the cultural question, Chinese civilization is very old and capacious, and I don't pretend to understand it, right? I wonder, though, whether the CCP has been able to extract what Wang Gungwu, my friend Wang Gungwu in Singapore, talks about a usable past from the vast reservoirs of Chinese history. It seems to me that the CCP has a very narrow, highly westernized, Marxoid way of thinking about human nature. And I don't think it, from what I know, and I don't know much, I don't think it comports with the nuance and the sophistication of Chinese civilization. So at a certain point, if China wants to move from a pipeline, sort of very, very sort of almost mechanistic way of thinking about the relationship of science and technology to innovation and military security, they want to move away from that to a much more creative, critical thinking, developmentalist kind of where they can really be their own masters of technology, where they don't have to steal, where they don't have to imitate, where they don't have to, manipulate the international trade system in order to gain advantage. That's going to be the real test, right? I don't know when that'll be. Maybe it'll be in 2025, but I doubt it'll be that soon. But there's a civilizational legacy to deal with in this regard, all right? That's why I'm not particularly pessimistic in the long run, because this is hard to do. It's hard for a civilization to jump out of its skin, right? And the Japanese haven't been able to do it either for kind of similar reasons. Again, true innovation, both for economic purposes, there's a philosophical germ in here, all right? And again, to go back to the culture, Aristotle said that people, no man can think without a picture. What did he mean? I think he meant people have a little like dominant metaphor in their heads, right? They use that metaphor as an organizing principle to think about abstract, difficult kinds of subjects. In the United States, the Anglo-American metaphor in the head is the dynamic equilibrium. It comes from clockworks and orreries people were fascinated with in the 16th century. So that's where checks and balances come from, e pluribus unum, separation of powers, the invisible hand. I mean, these metaphors are everywhere, right, in Anglo-American culture. And that kind of dynamic flexibility and the focus on the individual has allowed for a tremendous amount of creativity and innovation. It empowers people to think. You can ask questions. You can question authority. You can tell your teachers in school, wait a minute, well, what about this? You don't have to worry about insulting them or anything. Chinese culture, very different. So and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it or that it needs to change, but I don't think that China can develop the kind of autonomous, true creativity and dynamism in scientific and technology and that institutional cohesion unless the culture evolves from where it is right now. And it doesn't mean that the Chinese haven't come up with some amazing stuff, cutting edge stuff. And actually the Chinese advantage right now, it seems to me, is precisely, it's the last thing I'll say, in that institutional coordination and cohesion. There's some problems with a unitary state. I mean, it's a kind of Leninist culture that can't tell itself the truth. It doesn't function well with bad news. Nobody wants to tell their superior that something bad has happened and that maybe they're responsible for it. I mean, that's how the whole COVID thing went screwy from the very, very beginning. But In the United States, we've gone too far the other way. Our institutional cohesion is a mess right now. There's a new book I'd like to mention by Chris Brose called The Kill Cycle. And there's a review of the book by former comptroller of the Pentagon, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dov Zakheim, in the current issue of The National Interest, which is, as you mentioned, a magazine that I was editor of some years ago. And the review of Chris Brose's book is called The Book That Reveals Why America Could Lose World War III. And anybody who's interested in the military aspects of this competition, I urge you to either read the book, read Chris Brose's book, Kill Cycle, or just read Dov Zakheim's review. It is revelatory. I don't think most Americans don't understand just how haywire American institutional coherence has gone. People don't understand what the Navy. Let me just talk just for a second about the Navy. So the Seventh Fleet is floating out there, not too far from you, Professor, out there in the sea. The Navy, the U.S. Navy right now, which I love, and which I've done a lot of work with over the years, the U.S. Navy is a goddamn mess right now. The seamanship is not what it was. Navy ships are colliding. They're hitting each other. The maintenance is poor and underdone. There have been scandals, and some of them connected to, Southeast Asia. You all know about this. I mean, the behavior when the captain of the Theodore Roosevelt, talked back to the Secretary of the Navy, and when COVID broke out on the ship, on the aircraft carrier, that whole event, all right, that was extremely embarrassing and very uncharacteristic of the Navy. I'll tell you now a brief anecdote. I was at the Navy Memorial, which is an amphitheater in Washington, D.C., downtown, and the deputy CNO, Commander of Naval Operations, was there to just talk to active duty people. I was there for reasons I won't go into, but one woman, active duty sailor, actually said in front of a room of 250 people that she was afraid now. She was afraid. Why was she afraid? Because in her view, the sailors were not getting realistic training. They were training on computer consoles. They were playing like video games. But the emotional element of how you feel if you're in combat was nowhere represented in those video games. And it reminded me that the Navy, the United States Navy, over the past many years, has basically been a standoff tool. It's launched cruise missiles from various places, Mediterranean, Arabian Sea, right? But the Navy hasn't actually been shot at. This woman raised the issue of the USS Mason. Chinese-made missiles were fired by the Houthis in Yemen at the Mason. 2 missiles were fired. Neither one of them hit the ship, but it scared the crew half to death. What can you say about people who joined an armed forces? A Navy is combat arms force, right? Who are afraid to go out on tour, on duty, because they think their training is inadequate for combat. I mean, I really wonder, in a fight over Taiwan or an accident near Palawan Island, and I wonder if the Navy could fight. I really, for the first time in my life, wonder if the U.S. Navy can fight. That's how bad the institutional erosion has gotten. So I'll stop there.
Right. Okay. In the interest of time, we have got 2 more questions in the Q&A box, so I would read out both questions and post both of them to you, Adam. Right. The first question regards Huawei. Right. The question asks, regarding the Trump administration's blockage of Huawei and its sanctions against Huawei, is this really due to national security concerns, or are there other reasons like protecting U.S. tech companies or protecting U.S. signal intelligence capabilities? And the last question would be, what will be the Quad's end game?
Which end game?
The Quad's end game.
Well, I really think that the national security implications are by far the most important in the Huawei case. I think that the concern that all kinds of stuff is embedded in this, and that and again, as I said before, it's displacing Western or American technology, which is very useful in both protecting our own information and in penetrating others. So it's a change in the kind of the mainframe of the technology that's very, very problematical. So the United States is trying to limit it. I think it's overwhelmingly national security concerns. I think the commercial aspects are minuscule. I mean, if the United States had a competitor in the 5G business, right, that would be one thing. Then you'd have evidence that maybe there was a commercial, a major commercial concern, but we don't. We don't have a competitor in it. That's how far behind we are. So I think it's overwhelmingly national security. That's why Admiral Blair, took out the bullhorn and started yelling about it a couple of years ago. When you talk about, did you say court, C-O-U-R-T?
QARD, QAD Quad. The loose association, between the U.S.
Oh, the Quad. The Quad. Okay. Oh, Quad.
Japanese,
I don't know.
And Indians and Australians.
I find that useful. I mean, alliances get brittle. They get formalized, and it's necessary to shake them up and do ad hoc things sometimes with certain partners. I think switching in and switching out and making alliance relationships flexible and drilling them and having exercises with them, in particular ways. I think that's good. It keeps people on their toes. Another thing that's good about Quad and similar kinds of relationships is it builds personal connections among both diplomats and military officers. It mixes everybody up. It fattens your Rolodex. All right. People misunderstand how important this can be in a crisis. It's good to have personal relationships. It's good to have a kind of a sense of who you can trust, and you have to know people in order to know whether you can trust them. So I'm all for that. But I will say this. From what I know about the Quad talks, they've also become kind of formal and routinized a little bit in recent times, and they've ebbed and flowed. There's not a lot of support for this kind of thing from this White House, the current White House, which doesn't have a foreign policy. It only has it uses foreign policy as a prop for domestic political signaling. The United States really hasn't had a foreign policy for the past nearly 4 years, except maybe in trade. All the rest of it, no, it really hasn't. The problem is that I think people don't understand. They haven't thought through some of the wargaming scenarios that in parts of the military people do. So, for example, when President Trump made a remark after the Iranian attacks on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia some months ago, he said, "What did the president say?" He said, "Well, hey, they didn't attack us; they attacked Saudi Arabia." And then he made some remarks. Then, and another point, why should the United States continue to foot the bill for protecting the Persian Gulf when the United States doesn't need that stuff? We have our own resources, and we have fracking, and we get oil from Mexico and from the North, New World. If the Chinese depend so much on that oil, why don't they, put up or shut up, spend a little more money to defend the sea lanes themselves? This is a very, very, very stupid thing to do. And here's why. You could easily imagine a Chinese military planner saying, it's not really the supplies from the Persian Gulf that I want for me, for China. The overland routes, the pipelines that the Chinese are negotiating and that they've built to some extent, the overland route, and the nuclear factories and still relying on some coal and so forth, China can, without the maritime route, supply its own energy needs. And certainly for the duration of a crisis, it wouldn't be affected by the sea lanes of communication between the Persian Gulf and East Asia. But remember what I said about the Navy, the US Navy just now? If the Chinese could essentially blockade the sea lanes of communication between the Persian Gulf and America's allies in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, right? The Philippines, I could go on. What would that mean as a strategic asset, right? If the United States can't communicate, can't get to, and can't help sustain its allies, we would end up having to escort oil tankers into Yokohama and into South Korea. Could we do that? Remember that the balance of interests always trumps the balance of power. So the United States has vast military advantages over China globally in some general sense, but along the East Asian littoral, not necessarily. All right. And if the Navy is as decrepit as I think it is, and if Japanese shore-to-ship missiles are getting as good as I think they are, then what would happen if there were a fight? If it were to break out, from an accident, let's say, rather than any kind of a deliberate, bolt out of, no, Pearl Harbor kind of thing, bolt out of the blue. American aircraft carriers associated with the Seventh Fleet would start to steam. They would start to go east. All right, they would try to get out of harm's way because the political impact of a Chinese missile hitting a U.S. aircraft carrier and killing American soldiers and maybe sinking the carrier, that would be catastrophic. But as soon as American aircraft carriers start moving east, okay, then their aircraft can no longer reach land-based targets in coastal China, can't subdue the missile fire. So you would have a hell of a mess. And if we can't subdue the missile fire and we can't basically take on the Chinese Navy close to its own shores, how are we going to maintain the sea lines of communication to our allies? You see what that does? That's decoupling with a vengeance. That's the thing to worry about. So when an American president says, why don't the Chinese take over the security of the Persian Gulf? Oh my God, oh my God. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, right. Right. Just a very quick final question. 1 minute. We'll reach basically the end of our Q&A's allotted time. Final question. Will the Middle East be as important as the Pacific for the U.S. military? And finally, this is, for me, that's really an administrative question where can you just share the name of the 2 books you recommended earlier?
Oh, there are a bunch of books. What I can do, since I assume that RSIS has the email addresses of the people who have registered and who are attending the webinar. I can send those in writing, and then the office can do a spray of these citations out.
Okay.
So the Middle East. The Middle East. The Middle East is like the line in The Godfather. I tried to get out of it. They kept pulling me back. Again, it's the Middle East question in American foreign policy is a little like the hard decoupling with China. It's not an either-or proposition. There's no way the United States will or should completely abandon its interests and allies in the Middle East. On the other hand, we are overinvested, and at least 2 shooting wars are either over or very quickly coming to an end. So the military footprint of the United States in the Middle East is unnecessary. It's unnecessarily large. If it were up to me, I never would have put the 5th Fleet in Manama and Bahrain in the first place, and I never would have put a major command and control center in Qatar in the first place. So I think there will be a drawdown in the military footprint, but I don't think that means that all American interests in the region are going to be abandoned. I think that's just not realistic. But Asia, obviously, will become more important. But here's the thing. I really worry right now, as I've said at on other subjects in other webinars, I'm really worried about the massive lava flows of irrationality right now in the United States on both the left and the right. And I think I have a sense of why this is happening right now. It's happened before in American history. A lot of the same things that are going on now in the country happened in 1968 to 1970. I remember them well. What's changed isn't so much the things that are happening, it's the context into which they're falling. The context is very different. And what some Americans are doing right now is they and I said this, I think last month, they're re-theologizing American geostrategy. The Americans tend to think in terms of Protestant eschatology. Everything kind of has to fit into a passion play. There have to be good guys and bad guys. In order for the United States to do anything constructive in the world, it has to have, there are 2 conditions. It has to feel that it at home is a virtuous society. Otherwise, it has no entree, no cachet to engage with others. And then lastly, when it comes to international engagement, it takes leadership that's focused on the world and sees the importance of the world to the United States, that knows what kind of country the United States wants to be in the world. And right now, there's no consensus on that. So it's not just a question of, will the United States do more in Asia and do less in the Middle East? It's the question is, can the United States do anything coherently anywhere for a while? I mean, I really think things are in deep disarray, and that what we're seeing is a new normal, and that we're not going to see a resuscitation of the old grand strategy where the United States supplies global common security goods. We're not going to see that, and all kinds of problems are going to arise as a result of that. Last point. So there are people who think, and I may have said this in earlier webinars, there are people who think that the reason why weapons of mass destruction have not proliferated as much as people had feared that they would in the 1960s and the 1970s is because of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's a very nice applause line, but it isn't true. The real reason why proliferation of WMD has been limited to the extent that it has been the American alliance system. Because the American alliance system has protected vulnerable countries and it has created disincentives to proliferate. If the United States is no longer marshaling these alliances, and if it's no longer contributing common security goods to the global commons, then who is going to maintain the array of disincentives for proliferation? I think that I can name at least 3 or 4 cases where, with an American recession or an abdication of its former grand strategy and role, there will be a rash of proliferation scenarios. And countries that already have nuclear weapons are likely to react to that by redoubling and retripling their own stockpiles. That includes India, that includes China, that includes Pakistan. I don't think that makes for a better or a safer world, and it really worries me when you ask people, well, what could substitute for the American stabilizing role, relatively stabilizing role? Not that we haven't made lots of mistakes, we certainly have. What could, on the hegemonic systemic level, what could substitute for the American role that Washington's played over the past 65, 70 years? You don't come up with a lot of answers. How many other great powers are as disinterested as the United States has, relatively speaking, as the United States has been? Sort of the mousetrap effects of this recessional of American power, right, are massive and frightening. So I think the question, I think it's the wrong question. I think it's kind of the question is really, it's skirting the surface of much deeper changes that are afoot and that are much more consequential, need to be thought through.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Adam Garfinkle. I'm sure a lot of things that you shared today will be food for thought for all of us. We have reached the end of the RSIS webinar on this interesting subject of US-China technology competition. But although this is the end of the webinar, I have hoped that the points shared today will facilitate a conversation among all of us and prompt more additional thinking on this important subject. So, right, thank you everyone, and thank you, Dr. Adam Garfinkle. Right, thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks for attending.
Bye-bye.